The officer of the watch aboard HMS Illustrious felt the carrier heel into the turn as she swung onto course 060. A light variable wind came off the sea. Thin clouds sat at 8,000 feet, and a waxing gibbous moon, roughly 90% full, threw cold light across the flight deck. 21 aircraft sat spotted for launch, fabric skins trembling in the slipstream. They were Fairey Swordfish, biplanes, open cockpits, fixed undercarriages, and a top speed of 138 miles per hour, carrying a torpedo, slower than a family car on a motorway. Every pilot in the ready room knew the mathematics. They were about to fly 170 nautical miles into Taranto harbor, where 6 Italian battleships sat behind over 100 anti-aircraft guns, nearly 200 machine guns, and 22 searchlights. The expected loss rate was 50%. At the final briefing, when Commander George Beale began outlining the return route, Lieutenant Blood Scarlet cut him off. "Don't let's waste valuable time talking about that." Nervous laughter, then silence. It was the night of November 11, 1940, and Admiral Andrew Cunningham was about to gamble 20 obsolete aircraft against the most powerful fleet in the Mediterranean. This is the question that matters, not how the attack unfolded, but why Cunningham ordered it at all. The answer begins 5 months earlier, on a summer afternoon in the central Mediterranean, when Cunningham learned something that changed his entire approach to the war. On July 9, 1940, Cunningham sailed from Alexandria with his flagship warspite, the battleships Malaya and Royal Sovereign, the carrier Eagle, 5 cruisers, and 16 destroyers to intercept an Italian force under Admiral Inigo Campione. 2 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 8 light cruisers, and 16 destroyers. The Battle of Calabria should have been decisive. Warspite scored one of the longest-range hits in naval history, striking the battleship Giulio Cesare at 26,000 yards, nearly 15 miles. The shell hit the quarterdeck, started a fire, and forced Campione to reduce speed. But the Italians simply turned away under smoke and ran for Messina. Cunningham could not force them to fight. Royal Sovereign, making only 18 knots against Italian ships capable of 28 or more, was, in Cunningham's own words, a constant source of anxiety. She was a liability. The Italian fleet controlled the engagement entirely, and they chose to break it off. The lesson was devastating. In a conventional fleet action, the Italians would always disengage before Cunningham could destroy them. Meanwhile, their 6 battleships, 7 heavy cruisers, 12 light cruisers, over 59 destroyers, and more than 100 submarines sat in harbor as a fleet in being, forcing Cunningham to keep his own outnumbered force concentrated and compelling British supply ships to take the enormously long route around the Cape of Good Hope. Mussolini's advisors had warned him that Italy could not replace any warship larger than a destroyer, so the Regia Marina stayed in port. And it was working. Cunningham reportedly told his staff the line that defined everything that followed: "If they will not come out of Taranto, we will go in and get them." If this kind of naval history is what you have been looking for, subscribing genuinely helps. It tells the algorithm there is an audience for serious Royal Navy content. Now, back to Taranto. What most accounts miss is that Cunningham did not invent this plan. He inherited it. The idea of attacking the Italian fleet at anchor went back 5 years, to the Abyssinia crisis of 1935, when Admiral Sir William Fisher ordered a feasibility study for an airstrike on Taranto. The work fell to aircrew aboard HMS Glorious. When the crisis subsided, the plan was sealed and shelved. It resurfaced during the Munich crisis of September 1938. Admiral Dudley Pound, then Commander-in-Chief Mediterranean, summoned Captain Lumley Lister to review the old plans. Lister was uniquely qualified. As a young lieutenant during the First World War, he had served aboard the flagship of a British battle squadron attached to the Italian fleet at Taranto. He knew the harbor intimately, its depths, its approaches, its vulnerabilities. Working with Commander Guy Willoughby and Senior Observer Commander Lachlan McIntosh, Lister put Glorious's air group through intensive testing. Their conclusions were clear. The attack must happen at night because the Fleet Air Arm was the only naval aviation force in the world practicing night carrier operations. The main strike would be torpedoes, preceded by flare-dropping aircraft for illumination and diversionary bombing. Security was kept so tight that no written records were made. Just before war broke out, Pound, now promoted to First Sea Lord, advised Cunningham to consider the plan. When Lister arrived in the Mediterranean aboard Illustrious in September 1940, he lost no time suggesting a revival of the plan he had perfected 2 years earlier. Cunningham greatly favored it and encouraged its development. The operation was codenamed Operation Judgment, embedded within a larger convoy operation to mask its purpose. The original target date was October 21, 1940, Trafalgar Day, the 135th anniversary of Nelson's victory. Two problems forced postponement. A fire aboard Illustrious destroyed several Swordfish. Then HMS Eagle's aviation fuel system, cracked from accumulated bomb damage, was found to be leaking beyond repair. Eagle was withdrawn. 5 of her Swordfish and 8 experienced aircrew transferred to Illustrious, which would now launch the strike alone. Intelligence came from 431 General Reconnaissance Flight, RAF, flying Martin, Maryland aircraft out of Lucca Airfield in Malta. The unit included the legendary reconnaissance pilot Adrian Warburton. Daily flights over Taranto had been running since early October. On November 10, Warburton's aircraft endured intense flak and a 20-minute pursuit by an Italian CR-42 fighter. His observer, Sergeant Frank Bastard, confirmed the photographs were secured. Those images revealed something critical: barrage balloons that had not been there before. The attack plan had to be revised at the last moment. A final reconnaissance by a short Sunderland flying boat confirmed all 6 Italian battleships were still at anchor as late as 22:30 that evening. And then the signal came in. The next suitable moonlit night fell on November 11th. Here is where the operation should have been impossible. The Fairey Swordfish was, by every measurable standard, an absurdity. A fabric-covered biplane with a wingspan of 45 feet 6 inches, powered by a Bristol Pegasus engine, producing 690 horsepower. It cruised at roughly 104 miles per hour. The Spitfire did 362. The Messerschmitt 109 did 354. Even Japan's torpedo bomber, the Nakajima Kate, managed 235. The Swordfish normally carried a crew of 3, pilot, observer, and telegraphist airgunner, but for Taranto, a 60 imperial-gallon auxiliary fuel tank was fitted in the observer's seat to extend range. The crew was reduced to 2. The Royal Navy was stuck with biplanes because from 1918 to 1937, the RAF had controlled the Fleet Air Arm and starved naval aviation of funding. When the Navy regained control, it was too late to develop modern aircraft before war began. Its crews sang to the tune of "My Bonnie Lies Over the Ocean." If it weren't for King George's Swordfish, where the hell would the Royal Navy be? I think this is one of the most important details in the entire Taranto story. Cunningham was not choosing to attack with biplanes out of some romantic attachment to the past. He was attacking with biplanes because they were all he had, and paradoxically, their weaknesses became strengths. The Swordfish was so slow that advanced fire control predictors could not track it properly. Anti-aircraft systems calculated shell bursts far ahead of the aircraft. It flew so low during torpedo runs between 18 and 50 feet above the water that most flak guns could not depress far enough to engage it. Its fabric skin let bullets pass clean through without the catastrophic structural tearing that destroyed metal-skinned aircraft. It was, against all logic, the perfect weapon for this mission, but the aircraft were only half the engineering problem. Every naval torpedo specialist in the world believed aerial torpedoes required water at least 75 feet deep. Taranto Harbor averaged 40 to 49 feet. The Fleet Air Arm solved this with an ingenious modification. A drum was fitted beneath the Swordfish's nose, with a wire leading to the torpedo. As the weapon dropped, the wire pulled its nose upward, producing a controlled belly flop entry instead of a steep dive. This enabled launches in water as shallow as 22 feet. Torpedoes were set to run at 27 knots at a depth of 33 feet, calculated to pass beneath the Italian anti-torpedo nets. Each carried a duplex coil rod detonator that could trigger on contact or through magnetic influence, sensing the steel hull above and detonating beneath the keel. This is the part the official history often skips. The Italians should have been far better protected. They were supposed to have 87 to 90 barrage balloons over the harbor. A storm on November 6 ripped away 60 of them. Only 27 remained. Their cables now spaced 900 feet apart, 3 times the intended distance, leaving wide navigable gaps. Of the 12,800 meters of anti-torpedo netting required for full protection, only 4,200 meters were in play. Italian captains considered the nets a nuisance. They had been partially removed for a gunnery exercise and never re-rigged. At 20:35 on the night of November 11, the first wave began launching from Illustrious's flight deck. 12 Swordfish, led by Lieutenant Commander Kenneth Williamson of 815 Naval Air Squadron, 6 torpedo bombers, 2 flare droppers, and 4 bombers. Cunningham signaled Lister as they departed. Good luck, then, to your lads in their enterprise. Their success may well have a most important bearing on the course of the war in the Mediterranean. 2 hours later, the formation sighted Taranto. At 22:56, the flare droppers laid a line of 16 parachute flares along the eastern shore, silhouetting the anchored battleships against the light. Williamson led 3 torpedo bombers in a diving approach from 5,000 feet over the island of San Pietro. His torpedo struck Conte di Cavour beneath B turret, blasting a hole 27 feet wide below the waterline. His aircraft was hit by anti-aircraft fire and crashed into the harbor. Both Williamson and Scarlett were pulled from the water by Italian sailors and captured. Between 23:15 and 23:25, Lieutenants Kemp and Swain scored 2 torpedo hits on Littorio, one on the starboard bow, one amidships. The first wave was complete by approximately 23:35. The second wave of 8 aircraft, led by Lieutenant Commander Ginger Hale of 819 Naval Air Squadron, found the harbor fully alerted. A 9th Swordfish, damaged in a taxiing accident, had been repaired by its crew, who refused to stand down. It launched alone at 21:58 to catch up. Fires from the first strike were visible from 60 miles away. Every gun was firing. Land batteries alone would expend 13,489 shells that night, with thousands more from the ships themselves. Charles Lamb, flying as a pathfinder, watched the chaos from above. He later wrote that he saw the lines of fire switching round from both sides, firing so low that the gunners must have been hitting each other's ships. When they lifted their arcs to avoid this, their shells began exploding in the town of Taranto, behind the harbor. The Italian gunners were trapped in an impossible dilemma: fire low and hit their own fleet, or fire high and hit their own city. Despite this inferno, Hale's pilots pressed home. One aircraft scored a 3rd torpedo hit on Littorio. Another put a torpedo into Caio Duilio on the starboard side, flooding both forward magazines. Lieutenant Bailey and Lieutenant Slaughter in aircraft E-4H were shot down by fire from the heavy cruiser Gorizia after completing their attack run. Both were killed. They were the only fatalities of the night. By 01:22, the all-clear sounded over Taranto. The last Swordfish touched down on Illustrious's deck at 02:39. Every aircraft was accounted for except the 2 shot down. The expected loss rate had been 50%. The actual rate was 10%. When Cunningham and Lister proposed launching a second strike the following night, one officer in the pilot's ready room offered the immortal reply: "They only asked the Light Brigade to do it once." Bad weather made the question academic. The damage was devastating. Littorio took 3 torpedo hits. 2 in the starboard bow opened holes measuring 49 feet by 33 feet and 39 feet by 30 feet. A 3rd hit the port quarter, destroying the rudder. Her bows sank until the foredeck was awash. She would be under repair for 4 months. 32 crewmen were killed. Conte di Cavour took 1 torpedo beneath B turret. Admiral Brivanesi delayed the order to ground the ship until it was too late. By 4:30 in the morning, she had settled so deeply that only her superstructure remained above water. She was eventually refloated but never returned to service. 27 crewmen died. Caio Duilio took 1 torpedo on the starboard bow, flooding both forward magazines. Had it struck a few yards in either direction, it would have detonated those magazines and destroyed the ship entirely. She returned to service after 7 months. 3 crewmen were killed. In my view, the Italian failure at Taranto was not primarily a failure of defense. It was a failure of imagination. Admiral Domenico Cavagnari, Chief of Naval Staff, had warned Mussolini as early as March 1940 that Italy's navy could not prevail in an extended war. His advice was ignored. Admiral Antonio Passetti, who commanded the Taranto naval base itself, had grown accustomed to innumerable air raid alarms, mostly triggered by reconnaissance aircraft, which bred a dangerous complacency. The Sunderland flying boat on the evening of November 11 was detected by acoustic locators, but without radar, the Italians could only wait and wonder. More fundamentally, the Regia Marina did not possess torpedo bombers when it entered the war. The Italians had no practical understanding of modern aerial torpedo capabilities. They did not know the British had solved the shallow water problem. They grossly underestimated minimum launch distances. They had never heard of the magnetic influence detonator. According to Angelo Caravaggio in the Naval War College Review, their defensive measures were based on flawed assessments derived from incomplete knowledge of torpedo warfare. They were defending against an attack they did not believe was technically possible. The political aftermath was swift. The undamaged battleships Vittorio Veneto, Giulio Cesare, and Andrea Doria were immediately transferred from Taranto to Naples. On December 7, 1940, exactly 1 year to the day before Pearl Harbor, Admiral Cavagnari was forced to resign. Admiral Campioni was relieved the following day. Mussolini had called the Mediterranean Mare Nostrum, our sea. Captain Dennis Boyd of Illustrious told his crew before the attack that they were going to change it to Cunningham's Pond. The connection to Pearl Harbor is real, but more nuanced than most accounts suggest. Admiral Yamamoto had been discussing a carrier strike on Pearl Harbor as early as April 1940, 7 months before Taranto. The Japanese Naval War College had wargamed such an attack in 1927. Taranto did not inspire the concept. It validated it. Lieutenant Commander Takeshi Naito, assistant naval attaché in Berlin, traveled to Taranto within days and made careful notes about depths, distances, and the pattern of damage. In October 1941, he met Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who would lead the Pearl Harbor first wave, and conveyed the encouragement that if the British could successfully launch torpedoes in a harbor, then so could the Japanese. A more substantial exchange occurred when a Japanese military mission headed by Rear Admiral Koki Abe visited Italy from May to June 1941, bringing a list of 83 topics for discussion. They visited Taranto, studied the attack in detail, and the Italians shared their wooden fin torpedo technology. Lieutenant Commander Haro Hirota's team at Yokosuka Naval Arsenal successfully tested the modified Type 91 torpedo in August 1941, just 4 months before Pearl Harbor. As US&I historian Christopher O'Connor concluded, if there was a connection between Taranto and Pearl Harbor, it ran through Rome. The Americans had the intelligence too. Lieutenant Commander John Opie of the United States Navy was aboard Illustrious during the attack and submitted detailed reports. 55 copies were distributed. Lieutenant Albert Morehouse reported that British torpedoes could be dropped in water as shallow as 4 fathoms, that is 24 feet. Yet Admiral Stark wrote to Admiral Kimmel that torpedoes needed at least 75 feet of water. Opie's request to visit Pearl Harbor to share lessons learned was denied. No torpedo nets were installed. I think Cunningham understood what Taranto meant before anyone else in the world. His signal to Illustrious on her return was classic Cunningham, one line of devastating understatement. Illustrious maneuver well executed. In his memoirs, A Sailor's Odyssey, he wrote that Taranto and the night of November 11 to 12, 1940, should be remembered forever as having shown once and for all that in the Fleet Air Arm, the Navy has its most devastating weapon. He drew the comparison that captured the attack's true significance. In a total flying time of about 6.5 hours, carrier to carrier, 20 aircraft had inflicted more damage upon the Italian fleet than was inflicted upon the German high seas fleet in the daylight action at the Battle of Jutland. In private correspondence, his tone was more direct. The Taranto show has freed up our hands considerably, and I hope now to shake these damned ties up a bit. I do not think their remaining 3 battleships will face us, and if they do, I am quite prepared to take them on with only 2. Churchill announced the results to the House of Commons on November 13, 1940. The Royal Navy has struck a crippling blow at the Italian fleet. Only 3 Italian battleships now remain effective. This result, while it affects decisively the balance of naval power in the Mediterranean, also carries with it reactions upon the naval situation in every quarter of the globe. The immediate strategic consequence was exactly what Cunningham had calculated. With half the Italian battle fleet disabled, the Royal Navy could split into 2 independent battle groups for the first time, each built around a carrier and 2 battleships, a flexibility that had been impossible when the full Italian fleet had to be countered as a single concentrated threat. 3 weeks after Taranto, on December 9, 1940, General Wavell launched Operation Compass. With the Regia Marina hobbled, British forces drove hundreds of miles westward across Libya, securing 130,000 Italian prisoners. This flexibility also made possible Cunningham's greatest subsequent victory, the Battle of Cape Matapan in March 1941, where carrier aircraft crippled the cruiser Pola, and a devastating night surface action sank 3 heavy cruisers and 2 destroyers. That is a story for another video. Yet Taranto was not a perfect triumph. As Caravaggio has argued, Italian shipping to Libya actually increased in the months after the attack. The window of opportunity was narrower than Cunningham realized. In January 1941, German Fliegerkorps 10 arrived in Sicily and crippled Illustrious herself. And a year after Taranto, Italian frogmen riding manned torpedoes entered Alexandria harbor and severely damaged the battleships Queen Elizabeth and Valiant. it. Innovative audacity was not exclusively a British trait, but none of that diminishes what happened on that November night. 20 men in fabric-covered biplanes, flying at speeds their grandfathers would have recognized, attacked the most heavily defended harbor in the Mediterranean and crippled half the Italian battle fleet. They changed the balance of power overnight. They proved that carriers could sink battleships at anchor. They opened the first chapter of the carrier revolution that Pearl Harbor, the sinking of Prince of Wales and Repulse, and Midway would complete. Cunningham gambled 20 aircraft and expected to lose 10. He lost 2. In 6.5 hours of flying time, the age of the battleship began its end. That is the story.